So, if hard work equals success, why in the world do the poorest people in our society often work the absolute hardest? Seriously, just let that sink in for a second. It completely stops you in your tracks, doesn't it? I mean, we are all raised on this common sense idea of meritocracy, this deeply ingrained belief that if you just put your head down, grind it out, and sweat enough, you're inevitably going to rise to the top. But if we take a step back and actually look at the real world around us, well, that equation just doesn't balance out. There's this brilliantly cynical South American proverb that I absolutely love. It says, if hard labor were really such a good thing, the rich would keep it all to themselves. It is just perfectly spot on, right? It hits the nail on the head regarding the profound irony of physical labor. It really forces us to pause and rethink all of those baseline assumptions we have. Because if sheer, brute physical effort was the actual currency of upward mobility, the distribution of wealth in our world would look entirely different than it does today. And honestly, that thought sets up the whole core theme of our explainer today. And you know, this proverb isn't just a clever saying. It reflects a really harsh, everyday reality. All over the globe, the most back-breaking, exhausting work, stuff like breaking stones by hand, digging ditches, pulling heavy carts all day, is almost invariably done by the absolute poorest members of society. And yet, despite burning immense physical energy day after day after day, these folks rarely ever see a real improvement in their life chances. Think about it. How often does a poor day laborer actually rise up to become a multi-millionaire construction magnate? Outside of Hollywood movies, that kind of dramatic leap is incredibly, incredibly rare. So, welcome to our explainer on patterns of social inequality and exclusion, where we are unpacking Chapter 5. Today, we're going to dive deep into exactly why inequality is this massive structural reality that is deeply embedded in our social institutions, rather than just being some kind of individual moral failing. Trust me, understanding this completely changes how we look at success and failure. Here is our game plan for today. We are going to dismantle the hard work myth, decode how social inequality actually operates behind the scenes, look at the historical struggles around caste and tribes, uncover the often invisible exclusion in gender and disability, and then finally, we'll explore the future of inclusion. All right, let's jump right into part 1, the hard work myth, and start challenging some of those deeply held common sense views we've all grown up with. Now, the absolutely crucial point here is understanding the stark difference between individual merit and social inequality. Look, it's true. Personal effort, raw talent, and a lucky break definitely matter. If all other things were completely 100% equal in society, then sure, individual merit would be the sole deciding factor in who succeeds. But as we all know, things are rarely equal. Social inequality is not about individuals failing. It is about groups. We're talking about structured, systematic patterns of exclusion that go way, way beyond just how much money someone happens to have in their bank account. Which brings us nicely to part 2, decoding social inequality. And spoiler alert, it is definitely not just about money. Let's look at the actual mechanics of how this exclusion functions in the real world. So, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu has this incredible framework. He breaks down social resources into 3 distinct forms of capital. First, there's economic capital, which is what we usually think of: cash, property, material assets. But then there's cultural capital. This is your educational qualifications, your degrees, your overall societal status. And finally, there is social capital, which is basically your network, who you know, your contacts, your associations. And here's the kicker. These 3 forms of capital constantly overlap and can literally be converted into one another. Like, a kid from a well-off family can use their social capital, their parents' connections, to get into an elite school, which gets them cultural capital. That degree then lands them a high-paying job, which turns right back into economic capital. It's an endless loop. If you are excluded from those networks early on, trying to catch up through just hard work is like trying to win a race while running in quicksand. Okay, let's move on to part 3, caste and tribal struggles, to see how all this theory builds into some very heavy, concrete, historical realities. Listen to this haunting perspective from Dea Pawar's poem, The City. He's writing from the viewpoint of someone in the distant future who unearths a 20th century city and finds a sign declaring that a water tap is open to all castes. The narrator is just baffled, wondering what could it have meant? That this society was divided? That some were high while others were low? Seems like the Stone Age in the 20th century. It is such an evocative, piercing way to highlight the persistent, systemic humiliation faced by Dalits. It shows us how these deep-seated societal divisions still persist, completely defying all of our supposed modern advancements. And a very similar weight of history is carried by India's Adivasi communities. Scheduled tribes were historically known as the people of the forest. Their entire economic, social, and political lives were intimately shaped by their distinctive habitats in hill and forest areas. But it's important to note their isolation was never absolute. Their relationship with the wider mainstream society has historically been defined by a slow, systemic alienation of their natural resources. If we map this out on a historical continuum, you can really see how this marginalization evolved over time. Back in the pre-colonial era, there was ecological isolation, sure, but the boundaries were porous. Then, British colonial rules stepped in and basically introduced internal colonialism, subjugating Adivasis and aggressively alienating them from the very resources their survival depended on. And the tragedy is, these processes didn't magically stop with independence. Actually, post-1990s, with economic liberalization, it became even easier for massive corporate firms to acquire huge tracts of land, keeping that brutal cycle of displacement spinning. Just to ground that timeline in some concrete reality, think about massive infrastructure projects like the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the river Nirmada or the Pallavaram Dam on the river Godavari. We are talking about projects that literally displaced hundreds of thousands of Adivasis from their original habitats. This isn't just about moving people. It is a massive, systemic stripping of both economic and social capital. And that is a structural deficit you simply cannot overcome by just telling people to work harder. All right, shifting gears to part 4, gender and disability. Here, we're going to explore groups whose exclusion is often woven seamlessly and almost completely invisibly into the very fabric of our everyday society. Take a look at these fiery words from Tarabai Shinde. She wrote this all the way back in 1882 in Stree Parishdalana. She vehemently challenges the deep-seated prejudice and the incredibly derogatory language used against women, essentially asking society, how can you subjugate the very people who bore and raised you? The fact that she was actively fighting these entrenched patriarchal structures over 140 years ago, wow. That just shows you how deeply, deeply institutionalized gender inequality truly is. And when we move into the realm of disability, we actually have to completely rethink the word itself. The concept of social disability is an absolute game changer. It means that differently abled individuals are not marginalized simply because of a physical or mental impairment. No, they are marginalized because society is physically, systematically built in a way that completely fails to cater to their needs. The built environment itself, the stairs, the doors, the transport systems, acts as a literal instrument of exclusion. To really drive this home, Anita Gai, who is a brilliant scholar of disability in India, makes this powerful comparison. She compares the invisibility of the disabled in India to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which, if you don't know, is a famous, blistering indictment of racism in America. The disabled are rendered invisible by a society that literally just looks right past them and refuses to accommodate them. You see this constantly in our educational systems, which historically maintained entirely separate streams for disabled students, pushing them into the margins instead of actually integrating them. Finally, let's transition into part 5, the future of inclusion. We've talked about class, caste, gender, and disability separately. But as we know, human reality is rarely that neatly boxed up. Historically, sociology focused heavily on single, isolated categories. You studied class, or you studied gender. But as we move forward, the conversation has to shift to intersectionality. It's all about how these complex formations overlap. We have to look at what happens when you combine religion with caste or gender combined with religion. I mean, nobody lives a single-issue life, right? We all carry overlapping identities. And the most severe exclusion often happens right at the messy intersection of those categories. A prime example of this new way of thinking is the Sachara Committee report. This report took a hard look at the systemic marginalization of the Muslim community in India. It proved that to really understand exclusion, you have to look deeply at how different socioeconomic, educational, and religious identities compound upon one another. And it's that compounding effect that locks people out of social networks, cuts off educational resources, and ultimately starves them of economic capital. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge. Based on everything we've unpacked today, I want you to look closely at your own neighborhood, your workplace, your city. How do these invisible, intersecting categories of exclusion, this wildly uneven distribution of economic, cultural, and social capital, actually shape the physical world you walk through every single day? Because I promise you, once you start looking for these structural patterns, you realize that the myth of hard work alone simply isn't enough to explain the world around us. Keep questioning, keep observing, and I'll catch you in the next one.